Hey everybody, what's going on? Welcome to The Sit Down. I'm DJ Sixsmith. Jesse Sweet's here with us, director, producer, Enhanced, a new docuseries. Really excited to see it. Jesse, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
You got it. So let's wind it back. You've been a director for a while.
Right.
How did you get inspired to get into film?
Well, I think I've always kind of wanted to get into film since I was little and realized that I grew up in a small suburban town that kind of films were much more interesting than my life was. So I kind of gravitated towards that. And when I kind of kept pushing it to see okay, can I make a career out of this? Is someone ever going to say, no, you have to go do something else? And so I've been in New York about 20 years now and moved here with the goal of getting into documentaries because as I kind of started taking it seriously, was drawn to documentaries because they can take you to so many kind of fascinating places, kind of both geographically and intellectually, and sort of open up, as a storyteller, give you all this fertile material to get into and then hope to share with people. So been doing it a lot, and it's a very, liberal arts career that you got to jump around a lot. So, you go one project, you're on death row, and another project, you're, with a minor league team in Sonoma. So, have had the good fortune of working on a lot of cool projects.
Yeah, it really runs the gamut, that's for sure. So when you think about growing up, what were some of the films or just some of the filmmakers that inspired you at a young age?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when I originally got into it, I was young, I'd go see a lot of movies. And, before, again, I probably didn't get into documentaries until I was a little bit older. When I was younger, it was the kind of classic 80s, you sit there and you watch E.T. or Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Empire Strikes Back, and the hair on your head's blown back. And did that just happen? So I think I was definitely a child of the kind of classic 80s, big ticket movies. And then kind of as I got older, probably college age, sort of became more interested in documentaries and really, the kind of classics in the documentary world, like The Wisemans, where, this is a guy who'll go live inside a place for a year. Right. And then you're oh my God, on an equally kind of hair on the back of your neck sort of way, that it's sort of more surprising, but nonetheless exciting to me. And then I remember Errol Morris. I was lucky enough to go to a film festival, and he was there, and I had no idea who he was or his films. And I saw Fast, Cheap, Out of Control, which is a very kind of just stylized, but asking these big questions. I mean, in some ways it gets back to this because it's what does it mean to be human? And he's filming with a beekeeper and a robot scientist, and really kind of intellectually challenging. And so I'd say that those were kind of some of the early people who got me really excited. And
he's somebody that has really shaped the medium. Even the Belichick-Parcells documentary with just the way that they did the camera and just having those two guys there.
Yeah.
And that's his style, which is pretty incredible all these years later.
Yeah, and I think so. I think kind of he was somewhat revolutionary in that, before him, documentaries, a lot of them at least, it was we're going to hide our presence, and the power is going to come from kind of taking you into the worlds, which are documentaries I love a lot, Salesman or those kind of Maisels Brothers documentaries. But he's no, we're going to be as stylized as a commercial, and real, like you said, kind of provoke you by, having someone talk right into the lens or something like that. And, do some very elaborate staging and lighting and things like that. And so I think that as a kind of young filmmaker is an exciting thing to say, oh, you don't have to just fit one box. You can really go into that. And like you said, I think now Errol Morris's impact is hard to overstate stylistically. He's all over the place.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Yeah. So you're a Dartmouth guy.
Yes.
Take me back to being on an Ivy League campus. Is it overhyped, properly hyped, underhyped? How would you evaluate your time at Dartmouth?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, I'd say it's like everything else, a little overhyped and a little underhyped. I had a great education there, and they do have a film studies major there. It was one of the reasons I was attracted to it. And so you could, really kind of, that's where I'm oh, maybe I can really I can take a class. And the first day we watched Godfather 2. That's kind of cool. And so, and they tend to be small classes with really good teachers. And so I like that a lot. It can, being in New Hampshire for 4 years, in a pretty remote place, can be a little claustrophobic. So by the end of it, you're kind of okay, I know everyone here. I've kind of been in every building I've done.
I'm ready to go to New York at that point.
Yeah, no, totally. It's when's the next bus down 91 for sure.
That's awesome. So when you think about your career, you've done some amazing stuff, been to incredible places, but working with Anthony Bourdain is something that is really special and obviously has a lot more of an impact now. So When you think back to your time working with him, what was the most incredible part about that?
Well, I mean, working with him was the most incredible part about it. And he's someone I remember admiring for a long time. And when he's kind of really, the first show, No Reservations, I liked, but when he moved to CNN and started doing Parts Unknown, it was like, again, one of these things like, you can do that? You can go and just like hang out with people and eat with them, but somehow get to a deeper understanding of that place and like all these journalists who do it and do it in a stylized way, but have it be empathic and all these great things. And I mean, really another one who like took the format and just threw everything out the window and came up with a more exciting, creative way of doing it. And so I kind of like for a long time had wanted to work with him. And the good thing, I think, or one of the good things about documentary production is that, New York's a big city, but makes it a small town because people tend to kind of circle around each other. And so, through a friend of a friend, I ended up kind of meeting people at his production company. And when they had kind of been talking to them for a while, when the opportunity came up, I jumped on it to go with them. And it really is like he doesn't treat it like a series. He treated the Parts Unknown like a series of documentaries. And he really challenged the directors to come up with a creative way to tell this. I don't want to just go to Pittsburgh and eat sandwiches with French fries. Like, how are we going to talk about the people there? How are we going to understand the people there? And the kind of back and forth of kind of conceiving the show. He always comes in with like a strong opinion of what he wants to accomplish there, and then trying to find new and clever ways of doing it is unlike anything I've ever done. And again, it's like, you feel lucky to be part of that team, and then you think it's like, oh, you do too, and then I left to do other stuff. I'm like, oh, I'll come back and do more later, and it just seemed like he was kind of going to be a permanent fixture of our lives because he's such a larger than like individual. And when you're, there's the old saying that, great men are the one entity in the universe that gets smaller the closer you get to them. But he's the opposite. I mean, he really is impressive, and he is super authentic, and what you see on the screen is what you get. And was a larger than life, smart, funny, caring, thoughtful, provocative, kind of all these great adjectives you can think of person. And so you just feel lucky to work with him, and then, obviously shocked when the tragedy happened.
Yeah, I mean, given everything you just said, what was your initial reaction when you did hear the news and just think to yourself, how could this happen to somebody who I got to work with, who I said all these things about, and was going through something I had no idea about?
Yeah, I didn't believe it. I mean, I remember specifically, I was at the grocery store getting milk at 7 a.m. and I got a text about it, and I thought it was like, and I'm like, no. Someone said, did you see the tragic news? And I said, no, what about Bourdain? I said, what could that be? And I Googled it, and I'm like, no way, this must be some false, like, French paparazzi or something. And then, getting into it, it's just hard to imagine because he is he cuts such a larger than life character, and that, I think was, after the fact, I think we realized how beloved he truly was because the outpouring was enormous and deserved, but just, hard to really fathom that someone just as dynamic and sort of full of life of that could meet that tragic end. So
you went to Trinidad with him and the crew. What was the most fascinating part of that experience?
Well, Trinidad was, the whole thing in Trinidad was fascinating because I didn't know much about it. And I live in Crown Heights, which is a kind of has a large Trinidad population, and it really defies a lot of expectations about the Caribbean, both good and bad, that has a enormously, because it is this kind of interesting geographic location. That's the southernmost point on the Caribbean. It's 9 miles from South America. So it's almost like Gibraltar in that it's this kind of key point that's been fought over by different empires, right? It's been part of, France and Spain and Dutch, and then, it's been its own country and, part of the UK. And so it's kind of almost has a New Orleans quality to it where it's kind of accrued all these different cultures over time. And there's a large, huge Indian population. There's a large Lebanese population. There's a large Chinese population. You still get the colonial remnants. It is one of the richest countries per capita in the Americas because they're 9 miles from Venezuela. So they have oil, and so that brings good and bad with it, right? It brings money, and they don't have to be tourists, which is interesting to be in the Caribbean. It's not a tourist country, but at the same time, it does bring inequality. And recently, because it's become a shipping focal point in the shipping network, it's attracted cartels to move in there and move their products. So it's kind of, on many ways, surprising. I mean, the kind of interesting things were kind of going. We were there to lead up to Carnival and kind of like some of the dancing, and then we went kind of into the bush with some of these traditional stick fighting, which is like this kind of like underground martial arts thing.
Interesting.
There. Yeah, and Tony, it's like he loves sort of like pugilistic arts, I guess you'd call it. From jiu-jitsu to wrestling to all that. So that was fascinating.
Definitely. Yeah. So you've gone from doing stuff like that to your current project, Enhanced,
which
is coming out, and it's already out.
Yes.
It's on ESPN Plus.
Yes.
So,
streaming now.
Streaming now. Yeah. Exactly. The beauty of the internet.
Right.
So let's talk about specifically Algorithm Wars.
Yes.
I watched it yesterday. Really interesting on a number of different levels.
Right.
So starting with the Sonoma Stompers.
Right.
I mean, random minor league baseball team.
Yes.
No money, no knowledge, nothing. And then two guys come in and they go strictly by the book. So I guess my biggest question is, you have those people who are totally into the analytics.
Yes.
You have people like the manager who say, I don't really buy it, I don't believe it. How much should we believe in the numbers actually leading to a championship and success?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we're getting to a point where the data nerds have proven that you're not going to win without them. The question is, how much do you want to listen to them? But I don't think you can ignore what data is telling you. There was some big NBA, I don't know if it was sports management or just NBA management, but consortium last year. I wasn't there, but I heard about this, where Mark Cuban was on the stage with, I think, Magic Johnson or someone from the Lakers, and Magic was like, I think the whole data thing's overhyped, and we're not going to put too much stock into it. And Mark Cuban looked at him and said, I'm really glad you're my opponent because we're going to eat lunch. And I think there are just lessons that it can give you so much information that you're kind of fighting with one hand behind your back if you're not going to use it. I think the flip side of that is an over-reliance on it. That David Epstein, who's one of our former Sports Illustrated writer, wrote The Sports Gene, one of our kind of main contributors, has this saying where he says, it's called the Mcnamara Fallacy, alluding to Robert McNamara, Secretary of War during Vietnam, where he was so obsessed with metrics and that by the numbers we were winning in Vietnam that he wasn't looking at what was actually happening. And so you can, just because you can measure someone, if you think that's the only thing that is important, then you're going to miss a lot of other things that are important in sports. But I think from evaluating players to strategizing to analyzing your opponent, you just get such a richer sense of what's going on. And, it's like in the NBA, if you just look at the how to defend against a pick and roll, right? The most basic component of NBA. Every player is different, and there are these rules of thumb of what you do. But here they can precisely say, if these two guys do a pick and roll in this place, here's how you do the switch, over, under, and it's just so much more powerful than it's like we're going to kind of guess that this tends to normally work. So there are just these things where you can really kind of like break down the sport in a more precise way that there's no going back.
No question about it. And you mentioned the infusion in the NBA, and obviously the Daryl Morey part is so interesting because in Game 7, the Rockets miss almost 30 threes in a row.
Right.
And the numbers never would have guessed that.
Right.
So when you saw that happen and think back to your conversations with Daryl, what were you thinking at that point?
Well, it was amazing because I was thinking this is how they they built the team to win in this one specific way.
And specifically to beat the Warriors.
Yes.
And here they are.
In this play, and they had it exactly like, I don't want to say exactly where they wanted to be, but I mean they were playing the game plan that like the numbers told them to play. And I think Daryl is a very smart person, and he knows the numbers alone aren't enough. And so he would have realized that the human element is still there. And I think he knows, if you're really savvy, that there was this, it's really like how are you gathering and using numbers better than your opponents, and that it might give you a 10 or 15% better chance of winning or something like that. But it's not going to take a team that's outmatched and beat them. But at the same time, there's a human element to it. Totally. And if someone's, like, players still get cold, right? And if that happens in Game 7, all the numbers in the world aren't gonna do it. But it is it must have been a bitter pill that they were like, we helped reinvent the way threes play a role in games, and yet we're going to lose the championship.
Yeah, I mean, you think about somebody like Daryl Morey or Billy Beane or Bill James, people that have inspired so many different sections of their sport.
Right.
And, for Bill James, he has the Red Sox championship. For Billy Beane, the playoff success hasn't been there. Daryl Morey, third most wins in the NBA.
Right.
I think it really needs to be a championship to validate because the Sonoma team, they win the championship the next year.
Right.
The Red Sox can point to that. The Cubs can point to Theo Epstein winning. But at the same time, there's still that stigma this way doesn't win championships. And I think if a championship does come, maybe that can change the narrative a little bit.
I think you're right, and I think it is. It's like the one thing that's eluding Daryl. And again, I think he's like smart. The thing, he's smart not just as a numbers guy, but as a businessman and as a personnel man. So he's smart in many different ways, and talented in many ways. But I think for that narrative of like, here's a guy who really like literally came up reading Bill James in his like basement in Ohio, who had no business being in an NBA organization to running this highly successful one. Like the last chapter seems like it, for it to really be the story that it would make sense, has to be he gets a championship.
Yeah.
So I was hoping for it.
That would have been pretty incredible. And honestly, if they had won in the Western Conference, they would have rolled over Cleveland.
Yeah. And it would have been ridiculous because, I mean, if you think, I mean, he did tell me that, by the metrics, I remember we were filmed with him, early in the season, which ended up being when they lost in Game 7. That he can prove they're the best team in the history of the NBA. He's like, if you just look at the numbers, like, it's not even close. Like, you could make an argument who was the most dominant compared to their peers, and then you can argue for, Celtics in the 60s or Lakers, with Magic or Jordan. He's like, but if you just look at the numbers, he's like, this team would beat any other team in the history of the NBA. So
really
I think it's like, in a way, it's a unfair thing for him, but at some point, he'll be long enough, I'm sure, to get a title.
So you have all this data being acquired by the teams, and in the documentary, we talk about the Astros and the Cardinals and what happened there, and just data breaches that are potentially looming, and it's a lot of information. And so even when you think about like Megan Rapinoe's situation, like those are all her important private details of her whole life, and if somebody gets their hands on that, who knows what happens. So how do we deal with this potential world of data breaches? Yeah,
it's scary. Right, and that, in a lot of ways, I think when you get into these issues, it's scary not just for athletes, but it's kind of coming for all of us. I guess we're all wearing Fitbits and monitoring ourselves, but certainly for athletes, and I mean, it's scary on a number of levels. Let me break some of them down. I mean, first of all, there are people who want to become professional athletes, right? And there are many more people who want to become professional athletes who didn't actually get there. And that I think the trend is going to be that they have to have a digital passport that's going to be like, here are my metrics to show you. That it's like, I've been tracking throughout college, at least, maybe even high school, all my numbers, and I'm going to give it to you in some easy, digestible thing. And that you see Nike announced in 2016 this contract with the University of Michigan and some other players that they were going to track all these players' data for them, and it's going to, they would pay the University of Michigan, they'd track all this data, and then, the benefit is they'd give it to the coaches so they could analyze it. And then there's also this, it's somewhat speculative because it's all behind closed doors, but, according to people who've looked at the contracts, then they could also present this information to potential scouts who want to look at these players and be like, oh, I have 4 years of data, not just on the games, but on the practices and everything this person's ever done.
Everything you'd ever want.
Yeah. But it gets scary too because it's like, well, who else? Like Nike now owns this data.
Who else is privy to that information?
Yeah, and that the University of Michigan, there was some kind of blowback in their response. It was like, oh, well, we have to approve it, which to me doesn't inspire much confidence because A, why can't the players approve it, right? It's like, so Michigan is kind of getting, the money and...
Just college athletes getting screwed again, right? Just another day.
Yeah, and then like, it's not like the dean is going to review every player's data, say, they're just going to sign up. And you can think, again, we were talking about Black Mirror, you don't need to be a Black Mirror kind of, obsessive to think about all the negative ways this could go, because once you get massive amount of data on someone's health and physical, like, what if a healthcare provider wants to buy this and it's going to affect your premiums? What if it's going to, affect your insurance? There's all these different ways it can go wrong. And so there's like, even if the system works, it could end up in the hands of people we don't end handing up in. And then there's, like you're saying, breaches all over the place. I was talking to one of these privacy people who was saying, think about when's the last time you clicked on an agreement with iTunes or your bank or whatever and actually read it, right?
Never.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't know where the server is, right? So this stuff could be out of the country. What if all your data is being stored on a server in Crimea and now Russia goes in and takes over Crimea? I mean, these are real problems.
Right, or the Facebook situation, nobody knew that information was being sold.
Yeah, and it's being dumped out. So it's like people don't know what this data is going to be able to tell them in the future. It's going to be able to tell you more than you think it can. It has really strong health impacts. The other kind of frightening thing to me is a lot of the people who are using the data don't really understand it, so they're trusting some third party to interpret for them, and you don't know if they're right or not, right? And so they want to just sell you the data and say, oh, if I look at this, I can tell, his knee, 85% chance it'll last 5 years, and so then you're like only going to sign him 5 years and then cut him.
Well, that's the other thing I was thinking about, just the fact that it can impact your next contract, right? You had a knee injury last year, and somebody's looking at the data, this knee is done.
Right.
You're in your mid-30s, and then you're done.
You're
and that
done.
was information that wasn't impacting contracts 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Completely. And that they could say, well, we have these two players and we're going to invest in one of them, and he, according to the data, his knee, it's only, 75% chance it's not going to last that much longer. That could kill your career, as you just said. And because these algorithms are being, the company that's interpreting the data just wants to keep you as a client.
Right.
They don't know if it's like someone in the show says, it's not like if it was a medical device, because they're not considered medical devices, then it would have to go through strict, you'd have to be able to prove it says what you think it says. But here, they could say, well, this is our best guess, and the person interpreting it doesn't know the algorithm. So it's like there's an uncertainty about what the data really means.
So another interesting case in the documentary is Dellin Betances, pitcher for the Yankees, and a guy that believes in it, has the arm sleeve just to prevent injuries and figure out his arm slots and everything, but the Yankees can't tap into that information. So what role should the team have in that situation? Should it be just the private information of Dellin Betances, or should the Yankees be privy to saying, he's one of our players, he's a part of our organization, we should be able to tap into these numbers?
It's an interesting debate that I think every collective bargaining agreement is going to have to take on in whenever their next round is. I think the way it's working now, and everyone says it's like the Wild West, and maybe Westworld is a better example because there's like some creepy stuff going on, but it's kind of like teams are doing as much as they can get away with. So it's like, what should they do doesn't matter. It's what can they do, and it becomes a leverage thing. And so if you're a minor league player and they say, oh, you're in our farm system, you want to make it to majors, we got to have you wear this and collect it. You're going to say, yeah, because your number one gets
you want to get to the bigs.
You just want to get to the bigs. If you're Dellin Betances, if you're Tom Brady, if you're on the kind of a cover of a magazine somewhere, you probably have enough leverage to say, I'm going to wear what I want and do what I want with it. And I will say for the players, it does offer a lot. It's like for Dellin, it's like, you meet with him and he has a team that analyzes it and they say, here's how many pitches you can throw on every day of the year. And so he can, it's really been a huge aid for him to avoid injuries. And so you can see, the Tom Brady's and all these guys, it's in a way becoming kind of a tale of two cities. Like if you have enough leverage that you can say, I'm only going to wear my device, the team's not going to want to get in a fight with Tom Brady to force him to do it. Whereas if you're kind of a bubble guy, which, again, I think a lot of lay people assume every athlete's career is like Tom Brady, when in fact he's like
he's the
exception.
Yeah.
And I think most people are just concerned with their own, future contract, playing time, these things, and are just like willing to do it. We mentioned the case in the film about the Eagles, where they did have a mini revolt because they wanted to track their sleep.
Right.
And again, the players, they had a players union who pushed back and said, no, you can't collect data on our guys off the field. But I think that's the way it's going to go. Like I think we're going to end up with implants, not in the not too different future. It's like, because they're going to say, if you want to make it, and once they get people in at the lower levels, they'll just kind of carry all these like tracking devices.
I mean, that's like straight out of an episode of Black Mirror right there.
It really is, and I mean, it gets again frightening because then you don't know what they're gathering, and once again, if you have someone's, minimally, it's going to monitor, some proxy for hydration, heartbeat, sleep. You can once you're monitoring someone's heart activity, you can really infer a lot of medical information about that, and I don't know if you want that being sent out there when you may or may not know who's going to end up seeing it, how they're going to interpret it, if they're going to misinterpret it, if it can have impacts both on your professional career and other financial ways in the future.
So we've obviously talked a lot about the negatives involved with this. When you think about your specific doc and Algorithm Wars, they're just enhanced as a series. What are the most positive things about using sports science to improve yourself and improve your team?
I think the big one is I think it really does do a lot for injury prevention. I think in a very precise way, and some teams are doing this in a smart way, and some individuals like Dellin are doing it in a smart way. You can measure, it used to be like, oh, you don't want to pitch more than 100 times, but now they can say, oh, actually, here's how much force has been put on this part of your elbow so far today. and you know what the human body does. So I think it has huge impacts for elongating careers and avoiding injuries, which is good both for everyone, right? For the player, for the fan, for the management. I think it can, in some ways, help identify players who might not always fit the stereotypical thing. You know, we talk about Mookie Betts in here as someone who, you know, had this neuro-scouting thing that was able to see that he had certain skills. He might not be, you know, this 6'5" slugger, but that cognitively he kind of overcompensated for some of that. So I think it helps identify some people. And I do think it makes, from a coaching perspective, certainly in the NBA, in some games, it does make them more fun to watch. It's like, I don't know, I moved to New York like in the late 90s, and like that kind of like Pat Riley style of Knicks basketball was the ugliest thing. We're just going to slow it down.
We're going to scrap it out. Yep.
Scrap it out. And it's like, I can see if you're a diehard, but it's like, do you really want to see all your players end the game with like 6 fouls? Because
that's why basketball is so much better today.
So much better today.
The athleticism is just top notch.
The speed of the game.
Yeah, the scoring,
pace,
right?
Scoring.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's really kind of turned that into, basketball in particular, just a much more fan-friendly game to watch. And if you're a degenerate gambler, it's probably a good thing that it can, you know, help you win some money.
There's always that too.
Yeah.
All right, there you have it. That's Jesse Sweet. Enhances a new docuseries, Algorithm, more specifically his doc. Jesse, great talking to you.
Thanks
so
for having
me.
me.
Coming in.
It was fun. Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time here on The Sit Down.